السيدات والسادة، الحضور الكريم، أرحب بحضراتكم في فعاليات الجلسة النقاشية الثانية من منتدى مصر للتعاون الدولي والتمويل الإنمائي. هذه الجلسة تأتي تحت عنوان دور الحكومات في الدول الإفريقية في تحديد أجندة المناخ الوطنية الخاصة بها، حيث تعد المساهمات الوطنية لكل دولة من أهم متطلبات الدفع بالعمل المناخي عالمياً وتحفيز التحول إلى الاقتصاد الأخضر انطلاقاً من مبدأ المسؤوليات المشتركة والمتباينة. وفي جلستنا النقاشية الثانية من فعاليات منتدى مصر للتعاون الدولي والتمويل الإنمائي نسلط الضوء على دور حكومات الدول الإفريقية في تحديد أجندة المناخ الوطنية واحتياجاتها الفنية والمالية من أجل تحديد مساهماتها المحددة وطنياً. يشرفنا الآن في هذه الجلسة على المنصة السيدة الدكتورة ياسمين فؤاد، وزيرة البيئة لجمهورية مصر العربية، السيدة الدكتورة غادة والي، المدير التنفيذي لمكتب الأمم المتحدة المعني بالمخدرات والجريمة والمدير العام لمكتب الأمم المتحدة في فيينا، السيد إيمانويل نيرنكاندي، نائب رئيس الحلول الشاملة لمؤسسة التمويل الدولية، السيد الدكتور كيفن أوراما، نائب الرئيس بالإنابة وكبير الاقتصاديين لبنك التنمية الإفريقي، السيد أمبرواز فايول، نائب رئيس بنك الاستثمار الأوروبي، السيد فرانك ريزرمان، المدير العام في المعهد العالمي للنمو الأخضر. وتدير هذه الجلسة السيدة لبنى بوظة، رئيس تحرير قسم الاقتصاد لقناة سكاي نيوز عربية.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I know it has been a very long day, very intense, but I hope you enjoyed it. We've got 1 hour to discuss African countries' ownership in determining climate agenda. My name is Lubna Bouza. I'm the head of business and news in Abu Dhabi, the UAE, and it's my pleasure to return to beautiful Cairo for the second year for this edition too. Let me start by asking you, Dr. Yasmin, in May 2022, Egypt has launched its, can you hear me well or not? Okay. The National Strategy for Climate. You have said that the reason behind this strategy that you want to provide a better quality of life for your citizens, to boost economic growth and to preserve natural resources. You have named 26 different projects in different sectors. Not only that, today also we've heard about Nuwafi, so it's also part of that strategy under the same umbrella. Tell us more about the main pillars behind those ambitions, behind this strategy. What's new and where do we stand now?
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I'll try to be very short and precise because we're already late at the day. And all of us are definitely hungry. I was just telling Minister Gheda about that. The pillars of the strategy, as you have identified the vision, is not precisely only the technical aspects of climate change, which we all have been talking about, that's mitigation and adaptation. As climate is impacting every single part of the world, every single citizen on the planet Earth, our strategy consists of 5 pillars. The first one is how can you adapt to a low carbon pathway, that's mitigation, with the focus on the sectors of renewable, transport, oil and gas, industry, and waste. And the second one is related to adaptation. How best to adapt and have more resilient community? How can we protect our coastal zone? How can we have more accessibility and availability of water? And how can we have more smart and integrated agriculture? And that's the stereotype of a strategy on climate. And comes the means of implementation. And here we felt that it's very important to change the financial architecture at the national level. And here we would say, where are the pillars at the national level? How to green the budget? How can you integrate climate finance in the national budget? What's the role of the local banks? What is climate finance and what's the role of the private sector? And then comes the fourth pillar of the governance, which is who is doing what. To fight climate change, you cannot rely only on government, and you cannot rely on private sector, but a whole momentum of the society where everyone would have a stake in that process: the youth, the gender, the civil society, the private sector, the citizen. And last but not least, which is the research, the science, and the technology transfer. The strategy is derived not only from our vision of 2030 related to the sustainable development, but it also relied heavily on the SWOT analysis and how can we link that very national context to the global one of the overall UN SDGs. From that perspective, the strategy was prepared by the National Council for Climate Change, headed by the Prime Minister, and that gives that kind of a political commitment. Interministerial collaboration between the Ministry of Environment, as responsible for climate, with line ministries, as well as consultation at the level of the civil society and expert. And that would ensure a full national ownership to that. Where do we stand now? From the strategy, we have developed our NDC. The strategy is still 2050. The NDC is rather more a plan that includes quantitative targets as well as qualitative policy and measures. And from those NDC, from that NDC, we have set 3 tiers of priorities. Nuwafi is the first one on linking energy, water, and food, which makes the basic needs of humanity at the heart of the climate. The second set is the transport, and the third set is more of the oil and gas. So this is the story of how the process and the strategy was developed. We started actually in the governance part. We started in identifying the priorities of the project in mitigation and adaptation, but one important part that we started on is the youth and the children and the citizen, by launching the first ever national climate campaign, Return Nature to its Nature, by giving more awareness to the public, going into the governorates, working on the part related to a dialogue with the citizen. And in here you find the beauty, as the different governorates facing different challenges on climate change, and they have different ideas on how to do that. Finally, we have started and finalized as well the first climate change curriculum to be integrated within our reform program for the education. We started that 2 years ago, but we launched that last month, and we're now providing train of the trainers for the teachers to integrate that more in the school curriculum.
Very ambitious plan. I will come back to discuss on how we will be financing it. But first, Dr. Ghada, hearing Her Excellency talking, the first thing that comes to mind is, oh, it's all about priorities, about structuring, and then you can put together a proper plan. Let me ask you this. What is the priority policies that the government should consider in order to deliver on their climate promise or NDCs?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you very much. I think what we have been hearing since the morning are commitments from governments based on awareness and evidence and science that there is a real threat to the livelihoods of all, and that the poverty and poorer countries and poorer continents are suffering more than the ones who have been the cause behind the emissions. So this realization, this convergence that we have been seeing tells you that we are already taking the right steps by adopting policies that will address adaptation, mitigation, resilience. But I would like to add another perspective, a perspective that comes from our work at the UN Office of Drugs Crimes, where we deal with corruption and where we deal also with terrorism. There is a nexus between climate change and terrorism. There is a nexus between climate change and organized criminal activities that are taking place in places such as Africa. Another element that needs to be paid attention to is to address corruption and to put in place anti-corruption safeguards in place, because we have been hearing amounts of money that are huge, 1.8 trillion and 3 trillion to achieve those NDCs. countries that will be receiving this money, be it received from different innovative sources of finance, will need to have in place the anti-corruption safeguards that are needed to protect this money and to spend this money in a transparent way and to be accountable for this money, because this in and of itself will enable them to attract more resources. So putting safeguards against corruption is very important. Also, you need a strong criminal justice response and rule of law in countries to be able to implement the policies. So the policies are known, the announcements have been made, the speeches have been made over and over again, but you need to implement. And what Egypt is adopting in the next COP is to take those pledges to implementation. But in order to implement, you need a strong criminal justice system in place, and you need to train and build capacity and promote rule of law. You need to have in place laws that protect the environment, that address climate change, and you need to empower those in charge of the criminal justice system throughout the whole spectrum. You will be seeing in Africa and in other places in the world a lot of irregular migration, traffickers as a result of climate crisis. How are we going to address irregular migration, internal displacement, human trafficking, and so on and so forth? And lastly, I think it's very important to leverage the most important African asset, for instance, if we're speaking about Africa, which is youth and women. And I think Minister Yasmin has already started to speak about what is being done for advocacy, but Africa's youth is its real asset. And half of Africa's people were born after the year 2000. How are we going to use this asset? How are we going to leverage the African youth and make them, believe in those policies, support those policies, become the advocates of the policies? So a lot of capacity building is needed, and it's equally important to the financial resources. A lot of data and evidence is needed, and to continuously collect data and show evidence and base it on science. The convening power that countries have, building partnerships, what we have been seeing this morning, platforms that do avail an opportunity in a structured way to implement the policies. And how can countries have not just national strategies, but also regional strategies and continental strategies?
Building on what you just mentioned, I'm going to bring in Professor Kevin from the African Development Bank. There is a new report that you have released talking about the economic opportunities and the potential that Dr. Ghada just referred to in the African countries. Can you tell me the main finding, since we're talking about economic development in Africa, and also the technical and financial needs for those African countries to deliver their NDCs?
Thank you very much. Let me also thank the government of Egypt for convening this very important meeting and giving us the opportunity to share our perspectives in this regard. The report you referred to is the Africa Economic Outlook Report for the African Development Bank Group, which is focused on supporting climate resilience and a just energy transition in Africa. Now, we have heard a lot of discussion today, similar to all the discussions we've been hearing in the 26 years of discussions around this climate subject. So this report tried to focus on homing in on Africa, Africa's narratives around climate change, around green transitions, what it means for African economies, and what are the policy tools that African countries can actually deploy in order to be able to make the transition happen without dragging down the already slow development pathways of the continent. Some of the findings we had were a little bit sobering. First, we see that Africa is already losing 5 to 15% of GDP growth because of climate change. And this loss is not because climate change or greenhouse gases is unfair to Africa, but because Africa lacks the economic structures to adapt, the fiscal space to adapt, the institutions, the governance, and a lot of the things that we have talked about here. So that leads us to one main conclusion there, that for Africa and for most poor countries, the right approach which the Egyptian government has taken is the one to do, because investing in adaptation and investing in development and addressing the social and economic needs of countries is a best way to actually get to addressing the climate challenge. Then the second one was then trying to look at the energy transitions around the world. We just had a discussion in the first panel around gas and what energy options that we can utilize. What we found is that since the 1850s, countries that have managed to transition away from coal used gas as a transition fuel. So that conclusion for us then is that gas must remain one of the major transition fuels if Africa and other countries will be able to transition away from less polluting, from high carbon intensive coal to less polluting energy systems. And this transition takes time. So it's not something that happens quickly. And again, the pathways differ depending on countries' natural resource endowments, energy systems, level of growth, and so on and so forth. So a one-step-fit-all is a difficult one, a decision to make. Now, but what is the global community doing in order to help countries address the nationally determined contributions, which is a major pillar of the Paris Climate Agreement? We found out that Africa needs between 2020 and 2030, 1.6 trillion US dollars, translating to 175 billion US dollars annually to implement the NDCs. And then what Africa is receiving in climate finance to date is about 18.3 billion US dollars on average. This leaves us with about 108 billion US dollars in climate financing gap. To give you just an example, that amount is what Egypt alone needs in order to be able to successfully address the climate, the NDCs that we have all agreed to in COP21. Now, the other point here is then is when you look at the carbon budget of the world and try to do some optimization with regard to how each country of the world can still grow their economies, meet the water, energy, and other needs that are central to sustainable development goals without breaching the carbon budget of the world, you'll find that Africa has a carbon credit of about 4.6 trillion, 4.8 trillion US dollars by 2050 if you use the conservative social cost of carbon to date. But then if you juxtapose that with the climate finance that's coming to Africa, it only orchestrates what John Kerry told us this morning, that even the 100 billion we're talking about is just a drop in the ocean, because the financing gap for Africa alone is about 108 billion US dollars. So this raises a lot of challenges that we need to think about. But Africa has huge opportunities in green minerals, in green economy services to build competitiveness and actually alleviate poverty, address water security, and all the things that are really very important. So the imperative for Africa to drive fast on these cleaner technologies is an economic development imperative, not necessarily an environmental imperative. Because at the moment, Africa's per capita CO2 emissions is about 0.95 tons of CO2 equivalent, which is less than the 2 tons that we have calculated is required per capita globally to meet the climate agreement in Paris. So Africa still has carbon headroom to grow its economies. But the question is, if we continue to invest in high carbon energy options, you risk asset stranding because the technologies are shifting, the markets imperatives are shifting, and the policies are also shifting, and so is financing. But it raises the major question of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is a major pillar of Paris Agreement. I haven't heard a lot of it here, because countries that have emitted CO2 have already benefited by building their technological capacity, the structure of the economy is more resilient to adapt. And what we found is that climate finance structure today is actually biased against climate vulnerable countries. So the more vulnerable you are, the less climate finance you receive. So that global architecture of climate finance in itself needs to be looked at. The scale of investment that we have now in terms of climate finance needs to be considered maybe post-2025, and the global community needs to really very fast meet that 100 billion commitment to build some confidence at least. And there's also some double counting that's been happening because financing from MDBs and about, for example, in Africa, about 2/3 of climate finance flows in Africa in the past 10 years were debt instruments. And about 33% of that were non-concessional. So we're increasing the debt sustainability challenges for countries who are already at risk for problems they did not cause. So we need to look at this in a global perspective as well.
So we do have a huge financing gap. Let me bring that question to Mr. Umbraz. The European Investment Bank is the Europe Climate Bank. How are you working with the African partners to achieve your climate development goals or impact?
Well, what we try to do is to contribute to the solution of this big problem, and we know that the needs are huge. What we do is two things. One, we do more ourselves. What we have decided to embark on is an ambitious development of our finance for climate, but also for climate outside of the European Union. And if I look at Africa, what we did last year is 2.6 billion euros, 50-50 public-private, and 50% climate. And actually, if I look at Egypt, it is 1 billion last year financing of EIB, and 50% climate. So we allocate more capital to more financing, especially in Africa. And we also allocate more people because we are not present enough on the ground. And that goes together with the creation of a branch that is called the EIB Global that's going to deal with our activity outside of the EU. So the first answer how we can do more is do more ourselves. And the second answer is do more with our partners and with our African partners. And here let me just mention two examples quickly because it's already quite late. The first one is you referred to NDCs. I mean, NDCs need to be implemented. For the implementation of NDCs, what is of interest is what the subnational entities can do. We can finance them, and we do that actually. When you look at what we do for cities, for example, I mean, these are a big component of the strategies of government of countries towards reaching climate targets. And the second thing is, what can we do to make sure that we try to include climate consideration in lending that is not climate? Even if we have a target of 50% of climate in our financing, it means that 50% is not climate. But let me give you the example of Afrexim Bank. We did a lot of support to SMEs in recent years in Africa. And the loan we did with Afrexim Bank, the last one, we included a 25% window to help them allocate capital for supporting the SMEs who want to dedicate some space for preparing themselves for climate change. So these are the kind of things that we do. I will just finish by saying, when we do this, and we are not specific in this, we need to keep in mind three elements. One, we are never going to be able to do that alone, and certainly not with other MDBs alone. We need the private sector, and we need to find the right instruments that will bring the private sector. Two, of course, capacity building, technical assistance is absolutely essential. That's something we hear everywhere, and this is true. And actually, the specific funds that have been put in place, like the GAP fund, for example, to include project preparation, to include as early as possible for this is very important. And actually, not only in English, if I may say so. There are a lot of Francophone countries and non-Anglophone countries in Africa. And three, the importance of speaking together, of exchange, of lesson learned, and that's what we do, for example, in the Finance in Common Summit in October in Abidjan. It will be for the first time in Africa. And I think this is the kind of initiative that will also help put in place our ambitions.
Thank you very much. Emmanuel, I'm going to pick up on a very important point Her Excellency raised. She said it's very important to strike the right balance between mitigation and adaptation. I believe the World Bank Group has released a report on the commitment you have done for the last year, and you have increased the commitment to adaptation. How can we ensure that doubling adaptation finance will be achieved?
Thanks very much. So thank you. Again, pleasure to be here. So adaptation, it's really important, as you say, to find the balance, and it's not a question of either adaptation or mitigation. You referred to results that we've just announced as the World Bank Group, which show that for the last fiscal year, which just ended in June 2022, our financing, climate-related benefits, have increased by 19% from the previous fiscal year, so providing a total of 31.7 billion in financing, most of it going to emerging markets, and really importantly, 50% of it being for climate benefits. So it's really important that there's financing that flows to adaptation activity as much as it goes to mitigation. I think an important thing for us to notice is the numbers are huge. I think something that Ambrose said. So some numbers show that by about 2030, it will be about, on an annual basis, what will be needed is about 140 to 300 billion. And if we're not very careful, by 2050, it's about 280 to 560 million. So the numbers will be, at the point that Ambrose was saying, it's beyond the capacity of any one group to finance. So you need leverage, right? And what we see is only about 10% of financing is going into adaptation. So already there's little, and then very little going. So these, I would say, developments, when we focus our resources and focus them for adaptation, it's critically important, particularly for the continent of Africa. And so the question is, as we focus, right, on adaptation, what are some of the things that we could do? First, I think having the projects that we finance being Paris aligned, which is they are analyzed for making sure that they are going to be resilient. For example, we shouldn't build things in floodplains, and if we do, then we should construct them so that they're strong enough to survive floods. When we do agriculture, it needs to be smart agriculture so that it's we're using the best kind of seed, and it's the harvest is then protected. So it's really going to be important that we address those technological issues. I think an important thing for countries to deal with, I would say, risks that the private sector may not be super comfortable to deal with, is dealing with, for example, issues like data, providing good planning. And here, I just want to mention our country climate and development reports, which are done in support of the NDCs and which are done with governments, which are very rich resource that can be used for both addressing policy gaps and then for government and the private sector to consider how they want to address them together. And the very good news is that the one for Egypt is more or less complete and is a good addition to having the clarity that comes from planning and having the climate strategy that you have here and the kind of projects that you would have. So bottom line is it's really important to bring all sorts of actors, to public and private, in dealing with the challenge of adaptation, which is an even more significant challenge than dealing with mitigation.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Frank, the Global Green Growth Institute main goal and objective is to support and promote strong, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth in member countries. How do you help those member countries to translate commitments into strategies and implementation?
Thank you. Indeed, as we're discussing here, it's very important for countries to really have ownership of their NDCs, and that can start by having a national development policy that embraces that climate change and that green growth model. We are still a young intergovernmental organization, but some 10 years ago already, Ethiopia decided to have a green growth strategy that they called their climate resilient green economy strategy. And Ethiopia's first goal was, of course, to become a middle income country. But they also demonstrated that they could do that in a way that was low carbon, not even that difficult for Ethiopia, and that they had a big priority to make sure that their national development policy would make the country more climate resilient. So for them, it was not that easy, not that difficult to have an NDC in 2015 that was based on that national strategy. Of course, other countries had courageous environment ministers that came up with an NDC, but that wasn't necessarily embraced by the finance minister. I think the first goal is to have a national development strategy that has climate strategy mainstreamed. That's why it's wonderful to see in meetings like these so many finance ministers show up together with the environment ministers, and that we see more and more countries green their national development strategy. And yes, we politely say here that there should be a balance between adaptation and mitigation. But of course, for most African countries, there's some strong economies where emissions are relevant, like in Egypt, like in Nigeria, like in South Africa. For most African countries, it really should be adaptation with mitigation co-benefits. And recognizing that, putting adaptation in agriculture and in forestry and in nature-based solutions at the top of the agenda, and making that the top of the discussion with financial institutions. That is, I think, where we can see increased ownership from African countries, where it actually matters for their own population to be less vulnerable to the next typhoon, to the next drought, to the next flood. And then convincing their private sector and their banks that this is also their priority. Too many banks in Africa still haven't made climate smart agriculture one of their business lines, haven't yet factored in climate risks that are a big deal as well. So I think that is the way where we can still see increased ownership in Africa of that climate agenda, which shouldn't be a mitigation focused agenda, but one that really delivers a climate resilient future for their people. In that way, I think we can still make a long way to have both stronger policies and build capacity in a way that then attracts private investments and use that scarce ODA funding that the African Development Bank, the World Bank have to attract a much larger volume of private sector investment into those countries. 10 times, 50 times more than what the concessional finance can be. That is what, as a technical assistance organization, we support our members to achieve. And I think that that is difficult, but that I think meetings like these show that there is still a lot of opportunity to do that. So we thank the government of Egypt to show the way there and the development partners to follow that direction as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I know that it is really late and you're probably very, very tired. I'm gonna wrap up. I have one question to all of you. 2 minutes, Your Excellency, you probably can tell us how hard is the road to a carbon-free future, Your Excellency, having in mind the severe energy crisis the world is facing nowadays?
It's the same that I had mentioned in the round table of Nuafi, 3 things that we need to put in mind, whether we're talking about the globe or Egypt at the national level or Africa. First, we need to fulfill the commitments that we made even long time ago, since 1992, with the common but differentiated responsibility, because it takes that part of the credibility of the environmental multilateralism. Secondly, adding to what you have mentioned, I think that all that is sitting around the table are our dear development partners. But when we come to the governments and the ministers of environment and climate, it really matters on how to package the adaptation and access the finance. And besides requesting the local banks in Africa to start working on the risk assessment or even opening credit lines for the agriculture, I think there is a big role for the MDBs to start de-risking the capital for adaptation. And this could make really a big difference for the private sector appetite in doing so, because at the end of the day, they are not commercial banks. They are meant to be multilateral development banks. And last but not least is the importance of coordination and alignment among the NDCs and the needs that are there to match the finance. We know that the finance is little, but still the matching of that. And I'd like to commend here the African Union for bringing up last month the regional African resilience and adaptation strategy. That shows how Africa can speak with one voice and identify its needs from the national perspective in the NDC to the regional level. So we need here to start tapping on where are the regional aspects and start de-risking the capital and supporting that with the availability of the private sector. Thank you.
And on that note, Your Excellency, we wrap up. We end a very long day. Thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate, making the time and being here at, at the end of a very, very long day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to you.